Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Historian. The hour is late, the world outside is quiet, and the past is waiting for us. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a warm drink, and let the gentle weight of your day begin to fade. Tonight, we are not visiting a battlefield or a bustling marketplace. Instead, we are stepping into the silent, gilded corridors of the Great Palace of Constantinople, to look into the lives of children who were anything but ordinary. Did you know that for the young princes of the Byzantine Empire, the children born to rule the world, their games were often the most dangerous parts of their lives? They were not games of joy, but of survival, of strategy, and very often of profound sadness. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let's drift back together to uncover the sad games that Byzantine princes were forced to play. The life of a Byzantine prince began in a room lined with purple stone. This was the porphyra, the purple chamber, and to be born within its walls was to be porphyrogenitos, born in the purple. It was the highest possible status, a divine stamp of legitimacy that set you apart from every other soul in the vast Roman Empire. From your first breath, you were not a child. You were a symbol, a living piece of imperial propaganda. Your nursery was not a place of simple wooden toys and soft lullabies, but a miniature court. Eunuchs, tutors, and guards watched your every move, every stumble, every word. Every friendship was noted, analyzed, and reported. You lived within the sprawling, labyrinthine complex of the Great Palace, a city within a city. It was a world of breathtaking beauty, of shimmering mosaics that seemed to capture the light of heaven, of gardens filled with mechanical singing birds and roaring golden lions. But this beauty was a cage, a gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. The walls that kept assassins out also kept the world at bay. You might look from your window and see the bustling life of Constantinople, the greatest city on earth, but you were not a part of it. Your world was one of endless ceremony and ritual. You learned to walk, not to run in a field, but to process with solemn dignity through halls thick with incense. You learned to speak, not to shout with friends, but to deliver carefully crafted pleasantries to scheming aristocrats and foreign ambassadors. Your playmates were not chosen for companionship, but for political alliance, the son of a powerful general, the nephew of a cunning court official. Every interaction was a lesson in diplomacy and threat assessment. Who could be trusted? Who was a spy for your uncle, your brother, your own mother? The pressure was immense. The line of succession was a river of blood. Emperors were frequently deposed, murdered, or mutilated by their own family members. A father might be a loving protector one day and a paranoid rival the next. A brother who shared your lessons could, in a heartbeat, become the man who ordered your eyes put out. And so, the games began. Not on a checkered board or a grassy field at first, but in the heart and mind of a child trying to navigate a world where love and danger were indistinguishable. The first and most important game, the one that defined all others, was the game of succession. It was a game with no rules, only consequences. The prize was the throne of the world, and the penalty for losing was almost always a painful death or a life of miserable obscurity. The board for this game was the empire itself, and the pieces were armies, factions, and families. For a young prince, especially one born in the purple, you began the game as the most powerful piece on the board. But this made you the most obvious target. Your very existence was a threat to ambitious generals, powerful uncles, or even an older brother from a previous marriage who was not porphyrogenitos. The game was about survival, and the primary strategy was to become invisible or to appear utterly harmless. Consider the life of Constantine VII, known to history as Porphyrogenitos. He was the legitimate son of Emperor Leo VI. But his birth was controversial, as he was the product of a fourth marriage, which was technically against church law. When his father died, Constantine was just a boy, a regent. His uncle Alexander took the throne and despised the child, reportedly even trying to have him castrated. When Alexander died a year later, power fell to a council of regents, and then to a powerful admiral named Romanos Lecapenus. Romanos was clever. He didn't murder the young Constantine. That would be too crude and would anger the people who revered the born in the purple heir. Instead, he played a more subtle game. He married his daughter to Constantine, then declared himself co-emperor. Then he elevated his own sons to be co-emperors as well, pushing Constantine further and further down the line of succession. For 25 years, Constantine was a prisoner in his own palace. He was the legitimate emperor. But he had no power. He was surrounded by the family of the man who had usurped him. Any sign of ambition, any hint of rebellion, would have meant his immediate death. So what game did he play? He played the game of the harmless scholar. He retreated into the vast libraries of the palace. He spent his days and nights reading, writing, and commissioning great works of scholarship. He compiled encyclopedias on imperial ceremony, on military tactics, on the administration of the empire. To Romanos and his sons, Constantine looked like a dusty, irrelevant academic, obsessed with the past. He was no threat, but Constantine was playing the long game with every book he wrote. He was not just preserving knowledge, he was reminding the world of the proper, ancient, and legitimate way the empire should be run. He was subtly contrasting the glorious traditions of his dynasty with the crude usurpation of the Lecapenus family. He was building a case for his own rule, not with swords, but with ink, and when the time came. When Romanos' own sons turned on their father, the people of Constantinople and the court knew who the true emperor was. It was the quiet scholar, the man who had patiently waited, the one who was born in the purple. Constantine VII finally took his rightful throne, not by winning a battle, but by mastering the sad, lonely game of waiting. His youth was not spent learning to command armies, but learning to be forgotten. A victory, yes, but one built on a foundation of lost years, a childhood spent in the shadow of his own throne. While the game of succession played out in the silent halls of the palace, there were more public, more physical games that a prince was expected to master. The most prestigious of these was a fast and brutal sport called pastime, a Byzantine version of polo. This was not a friendly match on a village green. It was a spectacle of imperial power, played in a dedicated stadium next to the Great Palace. The players were the emperor himself, his sons, and the highest-ranking aristocrats. It was a display of horsemanship, courage, and martial skill. For a young prince, learning pastime was as essential as learning Greek rhetoric. To be a master of the game was to prove you were a true Roman, a worthy successor to the warrior emperors of old. The game was a whirlwind of thundering hooves, cracking mallets, and shouting men, all clad in the brilliant silks of their noble houses. The goal was to drive a leather ball through the opponent's goal, but the real purpose was to perform, to ride with effortless grace, to strike the ball with precision and power, to command your horse as if it were an extension of your own body, all under the watchful eye of the entire court. It was a test of nerve. The game was incredibly dangerous. Falls were common and could be crippling or fatal. A stray mallet could break a bone or shatter a skull. But to show fear was to show weakness. A prince had to ride into the fray with a look of joyful abandon, as if this dance with death was the most natural thing in the world. This game, however, was a double-edged sword. While it was a chance to display your fitness to rule, it was also a moment of profound vulnerability out on the field. Surrounded by other armed men on powerful horses, accidents could happen, or accidents could be arranged. A convenient collision, a horse that suddenly panics, an opponent who gets a little too aggressive. Who could prove it wasn't just the heat of the game? The stakes were made terrifyingly clear by the fate of Emperor Alexander in the year 913. He was the very same uncle who had so despised the young Constantine VII. Alexander was a man who reveled in the trappings of power. One sweltering day, he played a ferocious game of Tizicanian, ignoring the advice of his doctors. He rode with a reckless fury, pushing himself and his horse to the limit. After the game, he feasted and drank heavily. The next day, he was dead, from a catastrophic hemorrhage brought on by the violent exertion. His death plunged the empire into crisis and paved the way for the rise of Romanos Lecapinos. For a young prince watching this, the lesson was clear. Even a game could kill you. It could kill you through sheer accident, or it could kill you by providing the perfect opportunity for your rivals. Every time a prince mounted his steed for a game of Tizicanian, he was not just playing for points. He was gambling with his life, performing a deadly ballet to prove he was worthy of the crown. All while knowing that any of his fellow players might be hoping he would not ride off the field alive. It was a game of thrilling pageantry, masking a grim reality. Not all games were so loud and violent. In the quiet, candlelit chambers of the palace, another, more subtle game was played. This was Zatrician, the Byzantine evolution of chess. The game had arrived from Persia and the Byzantines, with their love of complexity and intellectual challenges, embraced it wholeheartedly. For a prince, Zatrician was more than a mere pastime. It was an education in strategy, a microcosm of the political world he was destined to inhabit. The board, with its 64 squares of alternating colors, was the court. The pieces, each with its own unique powers and limitations, were the players in the great game of empire. The king, the most valuable and vulnerable piece, was himself the queen or advisor, the powerful eunuch chamberlains and logothetes, the bishops, the influential patriarchs and clergy, the knights, the ambitious generals, the rooks, the governors of the distant provinces, and the pawns. The common people, expendable in the eyes of many, but capable of reaching the final rank and changing the entire game. A prince's tutor would sit with him for hours, the board between them. The lessons were not just about forks and pins. They were about foresight, patience, and sacrifice. You must learn to think 10 moves ahead, to anticipate your opponent's plans, to see the hidden threats behind his seemingly innocent moves. You must learn that sometimes. To achieve a greater goal, you must sacrifice a valuable piece. A knight might be lost to break open the enemy's defense, just as a loyal general might be sent on a suicide mission to secure a vital frontier. You must learn the art of the feint, the misdirection, to make your opponent look one way while your true attack develops on the other side of the board. This was the very essence of Byzantine diplomacy and court intrigue. The atmosphere of these games was often heavy with unspoken meaning. Imagine a young prince playing against his older brother, the heir to the throne. Every move on the board is a silent conversation. A bold, aggressive attack might be seen as a challenge to the brother's authority. A cautious, defensive game might be interpreted as weakness. A clever trap that wins the game might earn a moment of triumph, but also a lifetime of resentment from a future emperor. Or imagine a game against a powerful court official, a man who theoretically serves you, but who you know is secretly plotting to advance his own family. The game becomes a duel of wits. You are not just trying to checkmate his king. You are trying to read his mind, to understand his ambitions, to test his loyalty. The quiet click of the ivory pieces on the marble board would be the only sound in the room. But the tension would be immense. For many princes, especially those not in the direct line of succession, Zatrician became a substitute for real power. They could not command armies, but they could command their 16 pieces. They could not outmaneuver their rivals in the corridors of power, but they could trap a king on the board. It was a sad, small taste of the control they were denied in the real world. A game of perfect logic and clear rules in a life that was governed by chaos, paranoia, and betrayal. The hunt was another grand imperial performance, a game that blended sport, pageantry, and peril, far from the confines of the palace. In the vast imperial hunting grounds that stretched across Thrace and Anatolia, a prince could finally breathe fresh air. But this freedom was an illusion. The imperial hunt was as ritualized and as dangerous as any court ceremony. It was a chance for a prince to prove his manhood, his virilitas, in an age where the emperor was expected to be a soldier. A display of courage in the face of a charging wild boar or a cornered bear was a vital piece of political theater. It showed the army and the aristocracy that you were not some soft, palace-bred intellectual, but a man of action, worthy of leading them. The preparations were immense. Hundreds of retainers, beaters, dog handlers, and soldiers would set up a lavish camp. The prince and his companions would be dressed in magnificent hunting attire, riding the finest horses from the imperial stables. But this spectacle of power was also a moment of extreme vulnerability. Out in the dense forests, far from the secure walls of the city, anything could happen. The historical record is filled with emperors and princes who met their end on a hunt. Emperor Basil I, the founder of the mighty Macedonian dynasty, died in a bizarre hunting accident. The official story was that his belt became entangled in the antlers of a giant stag, which dragged him from his horse and gored him. He was rescued by an attendant who cut him free, but Basil, ever paranoid, suspected the man had been trying to assassinate him and had him executed. The emperor himself died from his wounds a few days later, but was it truly an accident? Or was it a cleverly disguised assassination? A rival could easily arrange for a stray arrow, or bribe a retainer to spook a horse at a critical moment. For a prince on a hunt, every rustle in the undergrowth, every shout from a fellow hunter, could be a potential threat. He had to focus on the prey before him while simultaneously being aware of the human predators all around him. The game was not just man versus beast. It was prince versus the ambitions of everyone in his party. Furthermore, the choice of prey itself was symbolic. To bring down a mighty lion or a fierce boar was a metaphor for conquering the enemies of the empire. A successful hunt would be celebrated with feasting and poetry, solidifying the prince's reputation. A failed hunt, or worse, a display of cowardice, could be a political disaster, whispered about in the court for months. It was a sad game because it forced a young man to equate courage with bloodshed, and to find his worth in his ability to kill. It took the natural beauty of the wilderness and turned it into another stage. Another arena where his every action was judged, and where a single moment of distraction could be his last. For some princes, the endless political games of the court, the physical dangers of the hunt and the polo field, were simply too much. Or, more often, they were deliberately excluded from these arenas of power. A younger son, the child of a less favored wife, or a prince under a cloud of suspicion, would find himself sidelined. With no path to the throne and no role to play in the empire's governance, for these young men, a different, more solitary game began, the game of scholarship. Cut off from the world of action, they retreated into the world of ideas. The Great Palace contained libraries of unimaginable wealth, holding the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years of Greek and Roman civilization. Here, a forgotten prince could find a different kind of kingdom. He could debate philosophy with the ghost of Plato. He could march with the armies of Thucydides. He could explore the cosmos with Ptolemy. This was not always a choice. An emperor might deliberately steer a clever but non-essential son towards intellectual pursuits, to keep him occupied and away from military or political matters. It was a way of neutralizing a potential threat. Turning a rival into a harmless bibliophile, the prince would be given the finest tutors, access to any manuscript he desired, and praised for his brilliant mind. It was a comfortable, luxurious imprisonment. The prince's game became the mastery of knowledge. He would engage in fierce theological debates, writing complex treatises on the nature of the Trinity. He would compose elegant poetry in the classical style, or write histories that subtly glorified his own dynastic line. This was his only way to compete, his only way to leave a mark on the world. Emperor Theodore II Lascaris, who ruled from Nicaea in the 13th century, is a perfect example. He was a brilliant scholar, a philosopher king in a time of crisis, but his life was a constant struggle against illness and the scorn of the military aristocracy, who saw his love of books as a weakness. He found solace in his studies, writing on everything from theology to natural science. His writings reveal a man of deep intellect and sensitivity, but also a profound loneliness, a man who felt he was born in the wrong age, forced to be a soldier when his heart was in the library. This game of scholarship was perhaps the saddest of all. It was a game played by men who were born to rule but were never allowed to. They possessed brilliant minds and vast learning, but were denied any real agency. They could describe in perfect detail how an empire should be run, but could not give a single order. They were surrounded by the symbols of power, but held none themselves. Their great intellectual achievements were monuments to a life of thwarted ambition, a testament to what might have been. It was the quiet, heartbreaking game of a life lived in the margins. There was one final game in the Byzantine world, a game that no prince ever wanted to play. It was the game that began when all other games were lost. This was the game of mutilation. In the brutal calculus of Byzantine power, death was not always the preferred solution for a defeated rival. A dead prince could become a martyr, his tomb a rallying point for rebellion, a far more effective, and in the Byzantine mindset, more merciful solution was political and physical neutralization. The chosen method was often blinding. According to imperial ideology, the emperor had to be a perfect physical specimen, an icon of Christ on earth. A blind man was imperfect, and therefore could never rule. And so, when a prince lost the game of succession, when his rebellion failed, or when a usurper seized the throne, the blinds often came for him. The act itself was one of unspeakable horror. It was typically carried out with a red-hot poker, a dagger, or sometimes by using a reflective bowl to focus the sun's rays. It was an agony designed not just to inflict pain, but to utterly destroy a man's future. To take away the light of the world was to erase him from the book of the living. Even while his heart still beat, the victim was then typically tortured as a monk and exiled to a remote monastery. His name would be changed, his fine silk robes replaced with rough wool. He was now dead to the world. Imagine the fate of John IV Lascaris. He became emperor as an 8-year-old boy. He was the legitimate heir, but the powerful general Michael Palaiologos saw his chance. Michael became co-emperor, and soon after retaking Constantinople from the Latins, he decided the boy was a liability. On Christmas Day, John's 11th birthday, Michael's men seized the child. They blinded him. He was sent away to a fortress to live out his days in total darkness, a forgotten prisoner. He was the rightful emperor, but he would spend the next several decades as a nameless monk, a ghost haunting the dynasty that had deposed him. This was the end of the game. For the prince who was blinded, there were no more moves to make. The board was overturned. The world of polo, of hunting, of debate, of command, was reduced to a black, featureless void. He might live for another 40 or 50 years. But his life was over. This was the ultimate sad game. It was a game where the winner took everything, not just the throne, but the loser's very sight, his identity, his hope. It was the final, cruel checkmate in the brutal political chess of the Byzantine Empire. And so, the games of a Byzantine prince were a mirror of his life, a life of immense privilege, lived on the edge of a precipice, from the cradle to the grave. He was a player in a contest he could not choose to leave. His sports were tests of his right to live. His hobbies were rehearsals for political warfare. His education was a tool for survival or a consolation prize for failure. They were born in purple, but their lives were colored by the constant, looming shades of fear, paranoia, and sorrow. They played on the most beautiful stage in the world, but the games were anything but beautiful. They were the sad, desperate, and deadly games that had to be played when the prize was the world, and the cost of losing was everything. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the silent world of the palace. I hope it has given you a moment of quiet reflection. May your own dreams be free of such heavy burdens and filled with peace. Until next time, sleep well.